Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, scrolling through his phone. At just 20, he had the height and build of someone older, with broad shoulders and a quiet intensity in his eyes that often made people mistake him for being in his late 20s. His caramel-toned skin gleamed under the faint light of the single bulb in his room, a stark contrast to the chipped paint on the walls. The room was modest, reflecting the reality of a young man juggling school and part-time work in Lagos. He glanced at the stack of textbooks on the small table by the window. Daniel was studying business administration at the local university, a course he had chosen more out of necessity than passion. His father had insisted he pursue something practical, though Daniel secretly dreamed of exploring creative endeavors like photography or writing. Still, he was determined to make the best of it. Outside his room, the faint hum of life in the neighborhood filled the air. Children laughing, a vendor calling out her wares, and the occasional honk of a passing car. Daniel's home was 2 streets away from the bustling church where he sang in the choir every Sunday. Music was his escape, a place where he felt seen and heard, even if just for a few moments. But today, his thoughts weren't on school, music, or his chores. They were on her, Grace. He'd met her a year ago at church, drawn first by her powerful voice in the choir, and later by her quiet elegance. Grace owned the grocery store he often visited after classes, and their casual chats over the counter had gradually turned into something deeper. At first, he had dismissed his feelings as a foolish crush. After all, she was married and a mother of 3. But Grace didn't treat him like a boy. She listened to him, really listened, and he couldn't help but fall. Daniel leaned back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Grace. "Can you stop by later? I need to see you." His heart raced as he typed a quick reply. "I'll be there." He knew what they were doing was risky, unforgivable in the eyes of society, even dangerous given her husband's position as a naval general. But Grace had a way of making him feel invincible, like the rules didn't apply when they were together. As he stood and grabbed his backpack, Daniel caught his reflection in the small mirror by the door. His face was youthful, but his eyes carried the weight of someone much older. He wasn't just a boy in love. He was a man willing to risk everything for it. And so, he stepped out into the fading daylight, ready to meet the woman who had turned his world upside down. Daniel walked briskly along the dusty road, the faint glow of the evening sun casting long shadows over the bustling neighborhood. The air carried the familiar scent of roasted corn from the roadside vendors, mingled with the distant sounds of children playing. It was a lively, close-knit community where everyone seemed to know everyone, except, of course, the secrets that lived behind closed doors. When Daniel reached Grace's grocery store, he paused. The small building stood proud at the corner of the street, its shelves always stocked with fresh produce and household essentials. Grace had built the store into a thriving business, a testament to her hard work and resilience. It was one of the many things he admired about her. He stepped inside, greeted by the soft chime of the bell above the door. Grace stood behind the counter, her smooth mocha skin glowing under the warm yellow light. She wore a simple but elegant Ankara blouse and wrapper. She looked up and smiled, a smile that seemed to melt away Daniel's worries.
"You came,"
she said softly, her voice carrying the warmth that made him feel at home. Daniel nodded, shifting his backpack on his shoulder.
"You said you needed to see me."
Grace glanced around the store. It was empty, save for the faint hum of the fridge at the back. She motioned for him to follow her into the small office behind the counter. The room smelled faintly of paper and the lavender oil Grace always kept on her desk. She closed the door behind them.
"How was school?"
she asked, sitting on the edge of the desk, her gaze fixed on him.
It was fine.
Daniel replied, his hands fidgeting with the strap of his backpack.
Same as always.
Grace chuckled lightly, but there was a tension in her eyes. She stood and walked closer to him, the small space between them making Daniel slightly uneasy. He could feel her warmth, her presence so commanding yet tender.
Daniel,
She began, her voice soft but firm.
do you know why I asked you here?
Daniel shook his head.
No, Ma.
She smiled faintly at his politeness, her hand reaching up to adjust the collar of his shirt.
You're not a boy anymore. You're a young man, smart, kind, and different. I see it in the way you carry yourself, the way you speak. You're mature beyond your years.
Daniel swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. Her words filled him with a mix of pride and confusion. Grace stepped back slightly, leaning against the desk.
I know this may sound strange, but I like you. I can't ignore it anymore.
Daniel stunned.
What do you mean?
She sighed, her eyes glistening with vulnerability. My husband is a good man, but he's always away. The house feels empty. My heart feels empty. But when you're around, I don't feel that way. You make me feel alive again. Daniel blinked, stunned.
Ma, I don't know what to say.
You don't have to say anything.
Grace replied, her voice barely above a whisper.
Just know that I care for you, Daniel. Deeply.
The words hung in the air, heavy and intoxicating. Daniel's mind raced. He had always admired Grace, but this was something he hadn't expected. He didn't know whether to feel flattered or terrified. The sound of footsteps outside the store made them both freeze. Grace straightened up, her composure returning in an instant.
Go through the back.
She whispered, pointing to the door behind him.
I'll call you later.
Daniel nodded numbly and slipped out into the fading daylight. As he walked home, her words echoed in his mind. He didn't understand why, but a part of him felt drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain. It was dangerous, forbidden, but it was also thrilling, and it was just the beginning. The streets were quieter than usual that evening as Daniel approached Grace's store. He had come straight from choir practice, his heart pounding for reasons he couldn't fully explain. The sight of the dimly lit storefront made his steps falter, but he pressed on, determined. Grace was looking up when she saw him. She wore a fitted blouse and a simple skirt, her hair pulled into a loose bun. She paused, her hand still on the lock, and smiled softly.
I thought you wouldn't come.
She said, her tone warm but laced with something deeper.
I wanted to check on you.
Daniel replied, the words coming out more awkwardly than he intended. Grace tilted her head, studying him for a moment before unlocking the door.
Come in.
The store was quiet, the shelves casting long shadows under the faint glow of the emergency lights. Daniel followed her into the back room, a small space cluttered with boxes and ledgers. Grace set her bag on the desk and turned to face him, her gaze steady and unyielding.
You didn't just come to check on me.
She said, her voice soft but sure. Daniel opened his mouth to respond but hesitated. He didn't know how to put his feelings into words, especially under the weight of her intent gaze. Grace stepped closer, the air between them growing heavier with every step.
You don't have to say anything.
She murmured, I see it in your eyes.
I see it in your eyes.
Daniel swallowed hard.
It's not right.
Maybe not.
Grace said, her voice dropping to a whisper.
But it feels right, doesn't it?
Daniel flinched slightly at the contact, but didn't pull away. Her touch was warm, tender, and disarming. Grace leaned in, her lips grazing his in a feather-light kiss. Daniel froze, his mind racing, but when she pulled back slightly, he found himself leaning in, closing the gap. The kiss deepened, slow and hesitant at first, then more certain as they gave in to the moment. He let himself go just for that moment. Grace pulled away fast, her breathing unsteady, her lips slightly parted. She looked at him, a mix of satisfaction and vulnerability in her eyes.
You should go.
She whispered, glancing toward the store's front.
Before anyone sees.
But he didn't say anything. Words felt unnecessary in the thick silence of the room. As he slipped out the back door, the cool night air hit his face, grounding him. His heart raced, his mind a whirlwind of emotions he didn't fully understand. He walked home in a daze, unsure of what the kiss meant or where it would lead. Inside the store, Grace leaned against the desk, her fingers brushing her lips. She had crossed a line, and she knew it. But as much as she tried to feel guilty, all she could think about was how alive she felt. It was dangerous, it was wrong, but it was far from over. Daniel avoided the grocery store for the next few days. The memory of the kiss lingered, and he wasn't sure how to feel. Part of him wanted to run back, to see Grace, to talk to her, but another part was terrified of what it all meant. He buried himself in schoolwork, trying to distract himself, but her face kept creeping into his thoughts. On Friday evening, his phone buzzed. It was Grace. "Can you come over? I need to talk to you. It's important." He hesitated, staring at the message. The last time he saw her, everything had changed. Still, he found himself typing a reply. "I'll come by after class." When he arrived at the store, the lights were dim and the closed sign hung on the door. He knocked lightly and Grace opened it almost immediately. She stepped aside to let him in, locking the door behind him.
Thanks for coming,
she said softly. Her tone was calm, but Daniel noticed the slight tremble in her hands.
What's going on?
He asked, shifting nervously. She led him to the back room again. The air was heavier this time, the space feeling more intimate than ever. Grace sat on the edge of the desk, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her blouse.
I've been thinking about us,
she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion.
What we did, it wasn't just a moment, Daniel, it meant something.
Unsure of how to respond, he wanted to say it meant something to him too, but the words caught in his throat. Grace stood and moved closer, her dark eyes looking onto his.
You don't have to be afraid. I know this is new for you, but I promise I'll take care of you.
Her hand rested gently on his chest, and he felt his breath catch.
Grace,
he whispered, his voice wavering.
What if someone finds out?
They won't,
she said firmly, her tone soothing.
We'll be careful.
Before he could say anything else, she closed the gap between them, her lips capturing his in a kiss that was bolder, more urgent than the first. Daniel hesitated for a moment, his mind screaming at him to stop, but the pull of her presence was too strong. He gave in, his arms wrapping around her as the world outside seemed to fade away. The sound of her phone buzzing snapped them back to reality, and it was her husband. Grace hung up the call and set the phone down on the desk. Her shoulders were tense, but her eyes softened when she looked at Daniel. The intensity of the moment hadn't faded, and the space between them felt smaller than ever.
It's fine,
she whispered.
He's at the mechanic tonight to get the car serviced. He'll be busy for a few hours.
Daniel's breathing was shallow, his mind torn between logic and emotion.
Grace, we shouldn't...
She stepped closer, placing a hand on his chest.
We've already crossed the line, Daniel,
she said, her voice low and steady.
This is real. What we feel is real. Don't fight it.
Daniel hesitated, but when Grace leaned in, pressing her lips to his, he couldn't hold back any longer. The kiss deepened, filled with urgency and the thrill of the forbidden. Grace's hands moved to his shoulders, pulling him closer as they lost themselves in each other. The back room seemed to close in around them, the world outside disappearing entirely. Grace's touch was both tender and demanding, guiding Daniel with a confidence that made his heart race. It was a moment neither of them could take back, a culmination of everything they had been holding back for so long, then ended up making love that day. When it was over, they lay together on the small couch tucked in the corner of the room. Grace's fingers traced lazy patterns on Daniel's arm his mind a whirlwind of emotions.
Are you okay?
She asked softly, her voice breaking the silence. Daniel nodded, though he couldn't bring himself to speak. Grace smiled faintly, brushing his hair back.
You're incredible, Daniel.
The sound of a car passing outside snapped them out of their reverie. Grace sat up, smoothing her blouse and glancing at the clock.
You should go. He'll be home in a few hours and I need to prepare.
Daniel dressed quickly, stealing one last kiss at Grace before slipping out the back door. As he walked home, the weight of what had happened pressed down on him, but so did a strange sense of satisfaction. He was in too deep now, and he knew it. Meanwhile, Christopher, Grace's husband, was busy preparing for his next posting. He spent the evening at the mechanic, ensuring his car was in perfect condition for the long drives ahead. Afterward, he stopped by a barber shop for a haircut, chatting casually with the barber about his upcoming assignment. By the time he returned home, the house was quiet. Grace was already in bed, her breathing slow and even. Christopher glanced at her sleeping form, his heart swelling with a mix of love and gratitude. He leaned down and kissed her forehead lightly before heading to the guest room to finalize his packing. The night passed uneventfully, but for Grace and Daniel, it had marked the start of something they could never undo. The morning sun crept into Daniel's room, but he was already awake. He lay staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the previous night. Every touch, every glance, every word Grace had whispered felt etched into his memory. Yet, along with the thrill came a gnawing sense of unease. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. For better or worse, his life would never be the same. At the same time, Grace moved through her morning routine with practiced ease, though her mind was far from calm. Christopher had already left to drop off the children at school and run a few last-minute errands before his 3-month posting. The quiet of the house offered her a brief respite, but it was also a reminder of what she had done. Her phone buzzed on the counter. It was Daniel. Are you okay? The message read. She smiled faintly, her fingers hesitating before typing back. I'm fine. Are you? His reply came almost instantly. I can't stop thinking about you. Her heart racing. She wanted to tell him she felt the same, but she also knew the dangers of encouraging him further. Yet she went ahead and responded. She typed, I am thinking about you too, Daniel, and we need to be smart about this. Later that afternoon, Christopher returned home, his demeanor calm. His haircut was crisp, and his packed bags were neatly lined up by the door. Grace greeted him with a warm smile, handing him a cup of coffee as he settled into the living room.
The kids will miss you,
she said.
And I'll miss them,
Christopher replied, his tone softening.
3 months isn't long, but it always feels like an eternity when I'm away.
Grace nodded. Guilt gnawed at her as she watched him sip his coffee, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface of their marriage. For a moment, she thought about telling him everything, confessing her mistakes, and begging for forgiveness. But the thought of losing her family, her stability, stopped her.
Don't worry,
she said instead, forcing a reassuring smile.
We'll be fine.
Christopher placed his hand over hers.
I know you will. You always handle things perfectly.
His trust felt like a knife twisting in her chest, but she smiled through it, holding on to the facade with all her strength. And that afternoon, he left. Grace texted Daniel again. Meet me at the hotel on Broad Street tomorrow. I'll send you the details. Daniel stared at the message, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure if it was excitement or fear that gripped him, but he quickly replied, I'll be there. When he arrived the next evening, the room was tucked away in a corner of the hotel known for its privacy. Grace was already waiting, dressed in a fitted dress that accentuated her figure. The air between them crackled with tension as Grace reached up, cupping his face in her hands. Daniel leaned in, his hesitation melting away as their lips met. The rest of the world faded, leaving only the two of them in the stillness of the room. Afterwards, Grace left for the store, her carefully constructed life intact. For now, whilst Daniel hung around in the room for a few more hours, then left for school. As she sat alone in the store, she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were beginning to close in. Daniel's world had shifted drastically over the past year. What had started as thrilling secret moments with Grace had become something deeper, more dangerous. They met regularly, their connection growing stronger, even as the weight of secrecy bore down on them. Grace, meanwhile, felt the duality of her life pulling her apart. At home, she played the role of a devoted wife and mother. But with Daniel, she felt alive, desired, and free from the constraints of her carefully curated life. However, the pressure was mounting. Christopher was back from his posting, and his presence filled the house with an energy she could no longer ignore. One evening, as Grace stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, she felt a sudden wave of nausea. She clutched the counter, the room spinning. It wasn't the first time this had happened, and she couldn't dismiss the gnawing suspicion growing in her mind. A few days later, Grace sat in her car, gripping the edge of the steering wheel. The pharmacy bag on the passenger seat contained a pregnancy test, and she hadn't found the courage to open it. Her thoughts raced as she considered the implications, what this could mean for her, for Daniel, for everything. When she finally worked up the nerve to take the test, the result confirmed her fears. She was pregnant. Grace met Daniel the next evening at their usual hotel. She hadn't told him about the pregnancy yet, unsure of how he would react. When he arrived, his face lit up at the sight of her, but his smile faded as he noticed her tension.
What's wrong?
He asked, concern in his voice. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly.
Daniel, there's something I need to tell you.
His eyes widened.
What is it?
I'm pregnant.
She said, her voice barely above a whisper.
And it's yours.
Daniel froze, his mind struggling to process her words. A mix of emotions washed over him. Shock, fear, and a pang of something he couldn't quite name.
Are you sure?
He asked hesitantly. Grace nodded.
There's no doubt it's not Christopher's.
For a moment, the air between them was thick with silence. Daniel paced the small room, his hands running through his hair.
Grace, this is a lot. I mean, what are we going to do? What do you want to do?
She met his gaze, her expression calm but resolute.
What do you think we should do?
Daniel hesitated, his voice breaking slightly as he spoke.
Maybe you could take it out. I don't know if I can handle this, Grace. I'm confused. I don't even know where to start.
Grace shook her head, her eyes glistening with tears.
Daniel, this isn't just about you or me anymore. This is a child, our child.
But if Christopher finds out...
Daniel's voice trailed off, the weight of the consequences crushing down on him. It'll ruin everything, for both of us.
Christopher won't find out. He'll think it's his. He'll never question it.
Daniel stared at her, his thoughts spinning.
Are you sure? What if someone notices? What if he...
I'll handle it.
Grace interrupted firmly.
You just need to trust me. Can you do that?
Daniel swallowed hard, nodding reluctantly.
I trust you. I don't know if I can handle this.
You can. We'll get through this together. But you have to stay calm, Daniel.
He nodded again, though the knot in his stomach remained.
Okay.
He whispered.
Okay.
At home, Grace's behavior began to shift. Christopher, ever observant, noticed her growing nervousness and distance. He chalked it up to stress from running the store and managing the household. But something about her seemed different. One evening, as he prepared to head out to a community meeting, he stopped in the doorway and turned back to her.
You've been quiet lately,
he said.
Is everything okay?
Grace forced a smile.
Just tired, that's all.
Christopher studied her for a moment before nodding.
If you need help, just say the word.
As the door closed behind him, Grace sank into the couch. The secret she carried was growing harder to conceal, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. As weeks went by, so is 40 weeks. The delivery room was filled with the sounds of hurried voices and beeping monitors. Grace's labor had gone smoothly, but as the baby was born, the nurse's hurried hands had failed to properly clamp the umbilical cord. Blood pooled faster than expected, and within moments the newborn's cries were replaced by alarms and the urgent commands of the medical team. Grace, weak but alert, watched in panic as the baby was rushed to the neonatal unit. She barely registered the nurse's reassurance that they would stabilize the baby. Her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and guilt. Christopher entered the room moments later. Concern etched deeply into his face.
What happened?
He asked, moving quickly to her side. Grace forced a weak smile.
They said there was an issue with the cord, but they're taking care of it.
His eyes scanning her face for signs of reassurance.
He'll be fine,
He said firmly, more for himself than for her. In the waiting area, Christopher sat tensely, his hands clasped tightly together. Grace lay exhausted in her hospital bed, but her heart raced with panic as the doctor entered the room, his expression grim. The baby is stable for now, the doctor began, his voice measured, but we have a complication. Due to improper clamping of the umbilical cord, there was significant blood loss. We need to perform an immediate transfusion. Christopher straightened.
Then do it. What's the issue?
The doctor hesitated, glancing at his clipboard. Neither the mother's nor your blood type matches the baby's. We need a compatible donor immediately, or the baby's condition will deteriorate rapidly. Gracie's stomach churned. She could feel Christopher's eyes burning into her, even before he spoke.
What do you mean, doesn't match?
He asked, his tone sharp. The doctor's silence was enough. Christopher turned slowly to Grace, his expression dark and incredulous.
Grace,
He said coldly.
explain.
Grace's lips trembled, and tears pooled in her eyes. She shook her head, unable to find the words.
I'm sorry.
She whispered finally.
Christopher, I'm so sorry.
He stood, his voice rising.
Sorry for what? Are you telling me this baby isn't mine?
Her sobs broke free as she nodded.
It's not. I didn't mean for this to happen, but...
You didn't mean for this to happen?
He cut in, his voice filled with disbelief and fury.
Who is it? Who's the father?
Grace couldn't speak, her sobs wrecking her body. The doctor, sensing the escalating tension, stepped out quietly to give them privacy. When Grace finally found her voice, it came out as a broken whisper.
It's Daniel.
Christopher's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides.
Daniel?
He spat.
That boy? That child? You've been lying to me. To our family for how long, Grace?
She couldn't answer, her tears falling harder. The doctor returned, interrupting the storm in the room. I understand this is difficult, he said gently, but we need to locate the father immediately. The baby's life depends on it. Grace shakily picked up her phone and dialed Daniel. When he answered, she could barely speak through her tears.
Daniel, you need to come to the hospital. The baby needs your blood.
There was silence on the other end before Daniel replied, his voice trembling.
I'm on my way.
He arrived with his parents in tow. The weight of their suspicion turned to horror as the situation became clear. Daniel's father's face was like stone, his mother's eyes filled with disbelief. You're the father? His father asked quietly, though the fury in his tone was unmistakable. Daniel replied, his voice barely audible.
Yes.
His mother's voice broke. Daniel, how could you? Before Daniel could answer, the doctor called him over. We need to test your blood immediately. If it's a match, we'll begin the transfusion. Daniel agreed and followed him, leaving his parents with Grace and Christopher in a tense silence. The transfusion was successful, and the baby was declared stable hours later. But the aftermath left lives shattered. Christopher stared at the sleeping baby in the neonatal unit, his heart a maelstrom of emotions. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the hospital, leaving Grace behind. Daniel's parents confronted him as they left the hospital. His father's voice was stern but controlled. "This is not how we raised you. What you did is unacceptable, but the child is innocent, and we won't abandon him." His mother was clearly in support of the husband's stance, her expression weary. "We'll be responsible for the baby's upkeep until you can. We'll be sending Grace a monthly allowance until you can. You need to finish school, Daniel. Get your life together. Then you can take full responsibility." Tears streamed down Daniel's face as he nodded.
"Thank you, Dad.
He whispered.
I promise I'll make it right."
A few weeks later, Christopher filed for divorce. Grace moved into a modest apartment, her once stable life reduced to fragments. She worked tirelessly, trying to rebuild and provide for her other children. She and Daniel ended their relationship, both recognizing the irreparable damage they had caused. For Daniel, the experience changed him profoundly. The thrill of forbidden love had been replaced by the sobering reality of responsibility. He visited his son often, vowing to be a better father than he had been a man. On one of his visits, Daniel stood by the crib, watching his son sleep. Though his journey was far from over, he was taking steps toward redemption. The story of their forbidden love had unraveled painfully, leaving behind a trail of lessons. Love without boundaries could lead to destruction, but taking responsibility for one's actions could pave the way for a better future.